So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Very pleased to welcome you to tonight's lecture in our Distinguished Lecture series and to welcome Margaret Litvin back to NYU Abu Dhabi, because this is not the first time she visits the campus. She was here 3 or 4 years ago for a conference organized by Paolo Horta on translation and world literature. And she's currently here in the context of the Global Shakespeare workshops that are taking place and that have just finished, which is why the room just filled up with some people, I think. In any event, Margaret, let me say a few words about Margaret Litvin. She's a historian of modern Arabic literature and theatre. Her first book, Hamlet's Arab Journey, Shakespeare's Prince and Nasser's Ghost, which was published by Princeton UP in 2011, examined the many reworkings of Shakespeare's Hamlet in the theatre and the political rhetoric of post-colonial Egypt, Syria, and Iraq. Published just as the Arab Spring uprisings faded into disillusionment, the book shows how Arab intellectuals since the 1960s have seen themselves in Hamlet, their times out of joint, their political hopes frustrated by a corrupt older generation. A companion anthology of translations for Arab Hamlets, of which I have a copy in my hand, and I can pass it around for people interested, has been published. This book has been published by Martin E. Siegel Theatre Center at CUNY, the City University of New York, so the Graduate Center. More recently, Professor Litvin has focused on reconstructing the tangled legacies of Arab women's experiences in Russia and the Soviet Union. Her articles, reviews, and artist reviews have appeared in Journal Arabic Literature, in Critical Survey, in PAJ, a journal of performing arts, Theatre Research International, PMLA, several Shakespeare volumes, and the online venues Marginalia, Review of Books, Words Without Borders, and Small N+1. She is translating currently also Sanal Ibrahim's 2011 novel, Al-Jalid, Ice. Currently at Boston University, Margaret teaches Arabic literature in Arabic and in translation, as well as seminars on literary translation, on the theory of translation. She teaches courses on global Shakespeare, Arab-Russian literary encounters, and the 1001 Nights in World Literary Imagination. She is the founding director of the Middle East and North Africa Studies Program in the Global Studies School. It's listed there. Born in Moscow, she holds a PhD in social thought from the University of Chicago and a BA in humanities from Yale, and has spent 3 semesters at CASA, or the Center for Arabic Studies Abroad in Cairo. Her research has been awarded many fellowships, one an Andrew Mellon Fellowship while at Yale University, a Peter Paul Career Development Professorship from BU, Boston University, an ACLS Frederick Burkhardt Fellowship for this current academic year, and an Alexander von Humboldt Fellowship for 2016 to 18. So I assume that's still to come. That's wonderful. In this current academic year, Professor Litvin is working at the Swedish Collegium for Advanced Study in Uppsala, Sweden, researching a book manuscript tentatively titled Another East, Arab Writers' Moscow Dreams. With that, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Margaret to the podium.
A huge thanks to Cyrus and Kat and the students and faculty of the Global Shakespeare Festival. I've had a lot of fun in the last few days listening and watching and participating, and hopefully what I'm saying here tonight will somehow pull together some of what I've learned from my friends from Egyptpur over the last few days. A detour on speaking good English. I'm going to take the risk of starting not at all with a Shakespeare text, but with a mildly racist occasional poem by a seriously minor 20th century British poet, Anthony Thwaite. You might know him as the literary executor, if you know him at all, of Philip Larkin. In the mid-1960s, Thwaite was teaching English literature at the University of Libya in Benghazi. That was 2 eras ago. even before the 1969 coup that brought in the 42-year-long reign of Muammar Gaddafi. Most people in the Anglophone world probably wouldn't even have known where Benghazi was. Thwaite was an intrepid traveler. He had previously taught in post-war Tokyo. Later travels would bring him to Pakistan and elsewhere. This is his 1970s poem, Girdle Round the Earth. As you can see, Thwaite reflects on those days of teaching Shakespeare abroad. This is a poem commissioned for a fundraiser for Shakespeare's Globe, to rebuild and refurbish Shakespeare's Globe, which has now been done to spectacular tourist magnet effect. He opens by quoting student exam papers in their corresponding accents. King Lear was foolish man, his girls me crazy. Says something certainly about the play. Brutus fallen sword for political reason is unambiguous, though not the way we native speakers might have put it, who share a language with the undoubted global poet. In Tokyo or Benghazi, so the first one was him making fun of an Asian accent, a Japanese accent, reading King Lear. And the second was an Arab accent, mixing up the B's on the P's, obviously. In Tokyo or Benghazi, he abides our questioning syllabus still, because of course that's what Shakespeare's for. He's for the syllabus. As I hope you'll soon agree, Thwaite got a lot of things wrong. He imagines that Shakespeare is God, a universal spirit who looks down on these poor people, these poor turbans and burnouses. Thwaite, is Shakespeare's prophet. He foolishly conflates global Shakespeare with classroom Shakespeare, a mysterious and terrifying deity in any language, as we've discovered this week. He seems to have met no natives before meeting his students. He's never had a conversation with an adult, let alone an accomplished artist, from one of the countries where he's teaching to see what Shakespeare means to people outside of British-run educational institutions. However, despite his condescending attitude, Thwaite also gets something right. When we come to the specifics, Polonius stabbed, dressed in a galabeah, Shylock, the Palestinian refugee, Hamlet's father, Serbo-Croat groan, Dunsinane transported to Peru, Kabuki for All's Well, No for King Lear. He's actually not crazy. He's amused, of course, at what the sweaty-fingered locals are doing and how they're mangling his, beloved compatriot Shakespeare, but he's also observant or lucky enough to catch that the garbling is not random. There are patterns, local canons within the canon, because in any given adapting culture, certain Shakespeare plays will resonate especially well with certain themes of great local concern. So Asian adapters have, in fact, had a lot of fun with King Lear. Maybe because it engages the key Asian problem of filial piety, i.e., how to be a good child to your parents even when they're crazy. This tradition goes on. Ong Keng Sen's Polyglot Lear, 1997, juxtaposes 5 different languages in a pan-Asian melange. The interweaving of Asian performance styles raises the family message to an international plane, where the manipulative father, Lear, speaks in the bass monotone of Japanese no theater, while the opportunistic daughters use the high-pitched formulae of Chinese opera. I was talking about this the other day. But it's not only Asians. Filial piety and modernization is a resonant problem for all kinds of people, for the Yiddish theater as well, for the same reasons. So in the late 19th century United States, this takes an optimistic tone, producing a King Lear adaptation by Jacob Adler that, like Nahum Tate's Lear in the British Restoration, gives it a happy ending. Lear regains both his eyesight and his beloved daughter. In the Moscow Yiddish theater, that's Michoil's on the slide there, that doesn't happen. It's deeply tragic. And Michoil's interpretation, which is iconic and heart-wrenching, is lovingly taken up by later Soviet adapters. Already you can sort of see an argument about how a local Shakespeare tradition grows. A text falls into an adapting context where some themes or issues or characters in it will resonate, and then the tradition grows on itself, where later adaptations will either explicitly reference or carefully avoid referencing earlier ones. And in the Arab context, we can see an example of how a regional Shakespeare tradition can be deployed once it already exists. This is Shakespeare, the friend of Arab democracy. That's what it says. A shair الروائي الإنجليزي الديمقراطي, right?
Yes.
Why democratic? Why? Yeah, why? Why is Shakespeare democratic? Why do you need to say Shakespeare is democratic to publish in 1912 a translation of a British text? Like, he's one of the good ones, right? He's not one of the evil colonialists. You should buy this because he's a shair English democratic. That's Gamal Abdel Nasser as a young man. When he was in high school, he actually played Julius Caesar. He played him as a conquering hero who defeated Great Britain, which I suppose is one of the things on Caesar's CV. But in that context, it was very important. Political uses of Shakespeare in the Arab context go back quite a ways. So Caesar becomes one of the 3 or 4 most often quoted and produced plays in Arabic. There are some others. There's Hamlet, because obviously it's about conspiracy and spying and an older generation that monopolizes power, right? That's what Hamlet is obviously on its face about. And The Merchant of Venice for obvious political reasons, and possibly Romeo and Juliet. There were a couple of Caesar translations into Arabic even before World War II. That emotional undercurrent of Nasser's performance as liberator of the masses and victor over Great Britain surely still reverberated in Libya 30 years later, whether or not Anthony Thwaite cared to know it. Okay, I promised you 3 lessons from Arabic Shakespeare. The first one is that the reception of great or prestigious literary text is not direct. We tend to teach how text B responds to text A. We're good at comparing 2 things. We're good at comparing the original with the remake, comparing the movie with the book. We're 2-eyed beings, we're binocular. We tend to look at the world that way. That kind of comparison comes easily. And so most teachers, if they teach this stuff at all, will teach how text B responds to and adapts and plays with and mutilates and whatever text A. If they're really, really super sophisticated, they'll also teach a little bit of context. You know, how that local version responds to its local context. And then they'll think they're really very sophisticated. But they will certainly teach the adaptation as being in direct dialogue with Shakespeare. This myth is silly, as I'll show you in a minute, but there's a reason it persists. Artists want it to persist. Do you guys know the film, the Yusuf Shaheen film, Iskandariya Leh? Can you read on the slide what's written on the board behind him there? Very good. Yeah, who's talking? I can't localize you. Yes, right. To be or not to be. That is the. What they're doing is cheating. The teacher has assigned them this dreadful classroom Shakespeare task of reciting the to be or not to be monologue. And Yusuf Shaheen's alter ego, Yahya, takes this moment to decolonize the Shakespeare that's being shoved down his throat by his colonial schoolmasters at Victoria College in Alexandria. And he takes this sort of moment, this masculine colonial imposition of Shakespeare. All his classmates are just getting out of it. They're just cheating. They're reading the text on the board and pretending they can recite. Instead, you can see from the subtitle, he is reciting from a completely different scene, from what he calls Mashhad al-Um, the mother scene. So he is re-importing his mother tongue and the mother character into this very masculine colonial space to decolonize Shakespeare, to reclaim it as his own. This is the Prospero Caliban post-colonial model of Shakespeare appropriation. I say Prospero Caliban because Caliban famously says, "You taught me language, and my profit on it is that I know how to curse." It's the sort of the Empire Writes Back model of Shakespeare appropriation. Fine, some appropriations really do work in that register. And for Yusuf Shaheen and for his fellow Victoria College student, Edward Said, it does work that way. Edward Said, in his autobiography, Out of Place, has almost exactly the same scene. It's amazing. He describes reading the mother scene from Hamlet, the closet scene, with his mother in Cairo, which I think would be a deeply creepy thing to do, but it's Edward Said, so it's okay. So for them, yes, they received Shakespeare at the hands of their colonial schoolmasters. They had to sort of, digest it or spit it out and rebel against it and make it their own, all this business. That model does not apply to the vast majority of readers. How many of you can remember your first engagement with Shakespeare? First time you ever heard a Shakespeare quote, movie, line, critique? Let's hear some. What do you remember? Yeah.
A traveling production of As You Like It.
Okay. Theater as first experience. Everyone's thinking way too high. You're not thinking of the time you heard someone say, oh, I think she's protesting too much. Yeah.
I had a children's book of 10 of Shakespeare's best plays, and it was all like tiny and abridged and for like kids as well.
Okay. Productions, abridgments. Who else remembers? It's hard to remember. The Lion King, yes, adaptations or non-adaptations, yeah. So you get the idea. Yeah, what do you remember? Absolutely. And once you've seen a film, you can't unsee it. It will shape how you read the text when you come to the text. So to say that the text is primary and the film is secondary is a little bit arbitrary. Whatever's primary for you is what you saw first, what registered. And in many cases, it has sunk down to an archaeological layer so deep that you don't even remember what it is anymore. It's also a fact that these things are in the culture, and the more prestigious the text, I'm not sure how many texts my model of appropriation works for, but it certainly works for Shakespeare. My 9-year-old son gets that cartoon. He has not read Hamlet. Why does he get it? Because it's in the air. You know it to be or not to be many years before you ever encounter Shakespeare, whether in production or on film or anything else. So I've proposed the model of how to teach Shakespeare adaptation that's a little bit more complicated than the 2-column one that I showed you before, where basically Shakespeare's text is a source, maybe, or maybe not. The adapter may not ever have read it. Previous Shakespeare adaptations figure in. The local Shakespeare tradition is important. And of course, there are political contexts as well as literary contexts that determine which foreign texts are fashionable at a given time. So what is available and attractive to you depends on your historical circumstances, as I'll show in a moment. International alignments, social tensions, cultural fashions, etc. Shakespeare's text is just one element. So I will come to a case study that will show that, again, the reason this is hard to see is that these other intertexts, the other sources, are many and in many cases hidden. I'm going to talk to you about the earliest surviving Arabic translation of Hamlet by Tanyus Abdu, published in 1901. Tanyus Abdu is kind of the bad boy of Arabic translation. Everyone loves to hate on him. He is accused of authoring around 400 Arabizations of European texts. And his Hamlet is a disaster. It's a musical with a happy ending. Famously, here's the happy ending. The ghost comes back down to judge the assembled company and says, you know, as for you, live happy on earth, forgiven in heaven. Ascend before my eyes to your uncle's place, for this throne was created only for your majesty. And, you know, the chorus sings from the wings, and it's all very, very silly. There's a reason. And so for 100 years, Arab critics beat up on Tanyus Abdu for producing this silly, mutilated comic adaptation of Shakespeare. And he didn't even translate from Shakespeare. He translated from the French, and he mutilated Shakespeare. Well, guess what? He didn't translate Shakespeare. He translated Dumas, the Three Musketeers, Count of Monte Cristo guy, as I discovered simply by bothering to look. It was not difficult to discover. It's just no one had ever bothered to ask. So it turns out that if you compare Tanyus Abdu's text not to Shakespeare's, which he never read, but to Dumas, which is reprinted in the complete works, Dumas' 1847 Hamlet, it's in Alexandrines. It fits the standards of French neoclassical theater, in which it would not do for the hero to die. And so Hamlet survives at the end. The ghost comes down to judge everybody as, it's a much better ending than Shakespeare's, frankly. It makes more sense. He ties up all the loose ends. He doesn't leave any plot holes. And, who's this weird Fortinbras guy? So that very organized, tidied up ending is what Abdu translates. The Yes, there are also some songs, because in addition to inheriting French texts, he also inherits French performance traditions and the kind of, it's been called teapot acting. You know, here's my handle, here's my spout, from the Comédie Française. And so the monologues, the soliloquies become more like arias. Now, people don't know this. And so, for instance, here's one graduate student writing a PhD thesis in Indiana, wanting very much to prove that her English is better than Tanya's Abdu's. And so she says, the style of Abdu's version is quite poor. Sounds as though it were written by a high school student. Several times Hamlet addresses Ophelia as sweetheart and angel, expressions of endearment we never hear him utter in the original. The paragraph in question, provides a good example of the manner in which the translator tried to play on the emotions of a culturally and aesthetically unsophisticated audience. All of the Arab inferiority complexes about being worthy of world culture on full display here, right? This culturally and aesthetically unsophisticated audience is incapable of distinguishing between good and bad art. Okay, sure, except in Dumas, he calls her a beautiful angel. Dumas invents a love scene between Hamlet and Ophelia before their relationship starts to break down, because it makes dramatic sense to show how things were good before they go bad. Film directors often do the same thing. They insert that scene in flashback where, like, the two of them are reminiscing about good times they've had together. And so if suddenly this is due not to Egyptian backwardness, but to French sophistication, you get a different reading not only of Shakespeare, not only of global Shakespeare, but of the status of Arabic culture. So this is the beautiful angel scene. And again, people love to hate on Dumas. He's perhaps the most irresponsible of, or not on Dumas, on Tanius Abdu, who was mostly translating French novels and who didn't even, he's practicing a kind of unlicensed genius. He writes without ever erasing a word or rereading a line, which you're not supposed to do as a translator, right? You're supposed to be really careful and slow and meticulous. If you write like Mozart wrote, but you're writing translations, you're a hack. He's accused of mass production. There are craft standards that Tanius Abdu is not holding up. And due to this kind of reviling of his economic model and his method, no one ever bothers to ask, well, what's the guy's source text? Which is this. There's a reason that you can't find this, because Tanius Abdu is at pains to conceal it. This is his title page, The Story of Hamlet, a play in 5 acts, authored by Shakespeare, the renowned English poet. Thank you very much. Not, authored by Dumas, whose plays are all the rage on the stages of Cairo, Beirut, and Alexandria. No, we're not going to advertise that. We're going to do all the cultural capital we can muster. We're going to be, Tanius Effendi Abdu, owner of the reputable newspaper Sharq. And we're going to be translating the renowned English poet Shakespeare, who, in fact, we've never read, but never mind. So if you look at what Abdu is doing, in fact, he's doing something more like this. There are French versions, there are previous Arabic versions which haven't survived, we don't have them. You get the idea. You also, from the role of French in here, and this is at a period when Egypt is actually under English colonial power, but it's still the French that has the cultural cred. So from this you get that there is often another high prestige literary culture that is the privileged interlocutor, the one that everything else comes through, and the one that everything else gets cross-checked with. So we're going to jump forward to the Cold War, and we are going to talk about why the most influential Shakespeare text for Arabic is not an English play, but a Soviet film. Theater in general was very important in post-colonial Egypt. It could be argued that Gamal Abdel Nasser, the post-colonial leader of Egypt and briefly also of Syria, and the icon of Arab nationalism, understood stagecraft much better than he understood statecraft, and tried to substitute one for the other. This is not my diagnosis, it's Tawfiq al-Hakim's in his bitter memoir, The Return of Consciousness. So at the same time, Nasser was playing this Cold War game of playing the USSR and the United States off of each other, and in that process, he got the Aswan High Dam And he also got a whole lot of different cultural influences. The reason that the Prospero Caliban model doesn't work for Arab culture is because Arabs do not grow up on a cultural island. They do not have the issue that Caliban has of not having a father around. They've got too many fathers around. It's really more of a Hamlet problem, where you have Claudius, you have Polonius, you have the ghost. You're like got fathers coming out your ears. So this is it. This is Ahdaf Suwaif in a book called Metzatera that says on any given night in Cairo when she was young, she's reminiscing after 9/11 for this lost period, she thinks, saying on any given night in Cairo you could go see an Arabic, Egyptian, French, Italian, or Russian film. And she names in particular the Russian Hamlet at Cinema Odeon in Cairo. This is the Russian Hamlet. You can see it's not Laurence Olivier. It's not, the man who thinks too much, the man who could not make up his mind. It's just the opposite. It's a man whose mind is made up. This is a post-Stalin film. It's an artifact of the thaw. Everybody involved in the production of this film had in one way or another suffered under Stalin. Shostakovich had been sort of marginalized for formalism and publicly humiliated in New York, forced to kowtow publicly and painfully to the Soviet regime. Koizintsev, the director, had been again accused of formalism and had to tread very carefully in his career. Innokenty Smoktunovsky, that guy playing Hamlet, he earned that face. He was a political prisoner in Siberia. The translation was by Boris Pasternak, who famously was forced by the Soviet regime to give up his Nobel Prize that he won for Dr. Zhivago as a condition of being allowed to remain in his country and not go into exile. So everyone involved in this film in any way had suffered under Stalin, and in the Soviet context, this was an outpouring. It was the iconic film of the thaw, and it was about the question of how to remain a decent person, how to maintain personal decency and integrity in a culture that is corrupt and rotten, and where time servers and dictators basically set the agenda. This film came to Cairo right away and made a giant splash. This is a photo from Majalat al-Masrah, theater magazine, showing an audience, as the theater magazine editors ironically comment, the audience for this panel discussion on the film. All these dressed up men, right? The panel discussion is better attended than any particular new play premiering in Cairo that year. So this movie clearly struck a chord or hit a nerve. When the National Theater, 1964 was another one of these big Shakespeare anniversary years. It was the 400th of Shakespeare's birth, the way we're now celebrating or whatever, commemorating the 400th of his death. So the National Theater finally got up the nerve to do Hamlet, which was a big deal for Egypt's National Theater. It was like, we belong on the map, we're a real serious country, look, we have Hamlet. Hamlet is used this way in every post-colonial society, absolutely everyone with a national theater. It's the first thing they try to do. And critics were openly kind of speculating. They were taking bets. What would this production, what would Karamotova's production be like? Would it be more like the Soviet Hamlet, or would it be more like the Anglo Hamlet? That's Laurence Olivier, the man who could not make up his mind, the Western Hamlet on the left. And in the event, he kind of fudged it and did a little of this and a little of that and avoided the problem. But the interesting thing is that critics and theater makers were aware of the problem as an explicit problem, that there are multiple influences, that you have to choose between them. The thing that most resonates with you have to take sides. Koizintsev's film was absorbed and kind of taken under consideration for later use. It was not used right away. Until about 1967, Shakespeare on the Egyptian stage and other Arab stages was not overtly political. The political message was that it was being done at all. Look, we have Shakespeare. We have arrived. We are a post-colonial nation that deserves agency and a voice in the world conversation. We deserve to rule ourselves because, look, we have high culture and we've shown that we're worthy of it. That political message was pretty much discarded after, I mean, you still see echoes of it. You see monumental King Lears starring Yahya Fakhrani, whatever. You see that stuff still, but that message was rejected by young theater people after the devastating loss in the June War of 1967. because it was like, you know, you can deserve agency and status all you want. The world is not going to give it to you. So that is not enough. So you have to do something else. And after Nasser dies, basically the story is he dies of a broken heart in 1970 because he can't make peace between the Palestinians and the Jordanians. Arab unity has splintered. His heart does too. And he is dead. And so he's available to be cast as the ghost of Hamlet's father. And that starts happening. And so then all the lessons from Koizensov's film, the lessons about the man who wants to be faithful to his father's legacy but can't, those lessons are allowed to come out. And Mohammed Subhi produces this very self-aggrandizing Hamlet that is an action hero. The contemplative thinking side of the character gets obscured by the plotting active side, and he becomes basically Che Guevara in doublet and hose. Mind you, he's not Egyptianized, he's not wearing a galabeah, he's not in any kind of local drag. Native costume or anything. It's the costuming is what he understands to be Elizabethan. But the underlying spirit is Che Guevara. He is a revolutionary fighter, furious and pure, seeking justice and freedom with integrity and honor. This is what one critic said, and this was a compliment that the contemplative side of the character is downplayed because that was seen to be irrelevant. Sobhi told me he saw the Koizensov's film 17 times. Kind of traveling around Cairo from cultural center to cultural center, wherever it was showing, because he was a theater student and had no money. So that's one way to adapt Koizensov's film once you've taken it. And there are sequences in the video of this play that directly resemble certain blocking from Koizensov's film. He's just stolen it verbatim. There's other ways. After about the mid-70s, this kind of revolutionary pose goes flat too. And people start making what we talked about in your class today, Cyrus, some parodies that show the ineffectiveness of the Arab hero Hamlet. This one is from Syrian playwright Mamdouh Adwan, a play called Hamlet Wakes Up Late, or to be clearer, I could say Hamlet Oversleeps. It's one of the plays finally translated. I'm so glad that this is finally available in English. Finally translated in that anthology that Phil waved around at the beginning. And so this Hamlet is a theater maker. He thinks he's making political art. He thinks that he's making a play that will lure and stab Claudius into revealing his guilt. And of course, in that context, in the late 1970s Syrian context or Egyptian context, this is baloney. A play can't stab. As Horatio puts it, mousetrapping intellectuals who adopt and adapt foreign texts for political purposes are sort of ridiculed in the play. You might ask, what's Adwan doing then? Right? Why would you make a play that dramatizes your own inefficacy? It's kind of a fun question, but he's really smart. He knows everything you know about the limits of political art, and he does it anyway. We can talk about that later. In fact, in his play, what finally calls the shots is Fortinbras, the capitalist, who at some point just declares, as long as Hamlet is present, the capitalists will hesitate to invest their millions in Denmark, and so Hamlet needs to go. And so he goes. Am I being clear? And that's the message of Adwan's play. It's still, so his Hamlet is not an action figure. He's ineffectual, inarticulate, and drunk all the time. But he's not Laurence Olivier's Hamlet. What he is a corruption and perversion and despair of Koizensov's action Hamlet and Sobhi's Hamlet. You can't understand that if you just read it against Shakespeare. If you read it text B to text A and ignore how path dependent it is, it'll just seem like a really weird adaptation of Shakespeare. But if you learn the history and you learn what he's actually responding to in the Shakespeare tradition as well as in the politics of his own day, the impending, though not yet announced, peace negotiations between Egypt and Israel and so forth, it makes much more sense. If you look at the path dependency, as in the case of Tanyas Abdu, if you look at what exactly is being responded to, the response becomes much more literate and much more legible to us. Here's another one. It's a 1984 play where Hamlet is the play within a play. فرقة مسرحية وجدت مسرحا فمسرحة Hamlet. So he puts on a play called Hamlet. Again, Hamlet, the Hamlet figure, the prince who hires the troupe to humiliate his uncle. is an ineffectual theater-making intellectual who drinks too much, who doesn't really understand the power structures in the regime. And it doesn't work to catch the conscience of the king. Right? That's what Hamlet's trying to do. The play is the thing wherein I'll catch the conscience of the king. Guess what? The king has no conscience. He's not going to stand up and betray himself because he knows that he can brazen it out. Doesn't this story remind you of anything, Uncle? Of course, my son. It reminds me of the country of Denmark, a beautiful country and famous for its dairy. I saw milk products there like I'd never seen before in my life. What a country. Go on, son. Right? I mean, if he's not going to have that response of a guilty creature sitting in a play, if he's just going to brazen it out, there's not a darn thing you can do unless you have powerful friends or bigger guns. And that is really the story of a lot of Hamlet adaptations in Arabic from the last quarter of the 20th century. In the 21st century, things get a little bit more strange. And you can already see things starting to get strange at the bottom there with Suleiman al-Bassam's Al-Hamlet Summit, which I'll come back to, a play written originally in English for a Western audience and that is kind of a graft onto the Arab Hamlet tradition that did not grow up organically from within the Arab Hamlet tradition, of which Suleiman al-Bassam was totally ignorant until I told him about it. And that one is actually set in the Arab world, unlike all the other plays that I've talked about. That one actually tries to localize in order to explain the Arab world to outsiders. You don't need to explain the Arab world to Syrians. You just stage Hamlet, and they know where to file it. In the 21st century, things get more interesting because audiences get delocalized. Audiences have already been delocalized with the advent of film. So Koizensov, for instance, has a diary where he writes about responding to Akira Kurosawa and to Laurence Olivier, from whom you can see he stole whole ideas and sequences and the whole setting of the castle there. But with the internet and with satellite TV, audiences get even more localized and intertexts get even harder to pin down. One second. So Suleiman al-Bassam's play, The Al-Hamlet Summit, premieres in Edinburgh in 2002. It's a reading of Hamlet where Elsinore is some kind of unnamed, corrupt Middle Eastern state. There's a suggestion it might have some oil. There's a suggestion it might have some sectarian tensions with some Shia in the south. There's the fact that Hamlet starts out as a disappointed college graduate who's returned home after studying abroad and ends up as an Islamist militant. Hamlet, son of Hamlet, sorry, I just love reading this paragraph, so I'm going to do it too. And the rightful heir of this nation's throne, my rule will crush the fingers of thieving bureaucrats, neutralize the hypocrites, tame the fires of debauchery that engulf our cities, and return our noble people to the path of God. Our enemies comprehend only the language of blood, for this the time of the pen has passed, and we enter the era of the sword. The rhetoric of this Hamlet, once he becomes an Islamist, actually incorporates quotes from both Sayyid Qutb and Osama bin Laden, which al-Bassam carefully credits in footnotes just in case you've missed them, because he wants you to understand. This text, again, you can see it doesn't read like a translation. It was written originally in English and later translated to Arabic for production in Japan at the Tokyo International Theater Festival. I'm happy to talk about the weirdness of that later. There's a good textual argument for Shakespeare's Hamlet as an Islamist. He's uneasy about sex and he doesn't like drinking. Remember that whole thing with Claudius, more honored in the breach. He's disgusted with the political immorality, political corruption, which he also reads as moral corruption in the state of Denmark. So al-Bassam takes this and runs with it. Of course, instead of falling into a stream, Ophelia blows herself up as a suicide bomber. And this created a certain buzz in theater circles worldwide and also in Western academia. So the title photo with which my talk tonight was advertised is a still from his Richard III production, which also was used as the cover for a book on Shakespeare and the ethics of appropriation, in which I have an interview with him sort of interrogating his license to do all this. So all of this buzz has some funny consequences, and I'm going to close with two sort of unexpected, I don't want to talk about influence, but two unexpected responses now to Al-Bassam's Shakespeare, to his Arab Shakespeare trilogy, that I've come across in recent years. One is a local one. Al-Bassam played the Hamlet Summit representing England at the nationally organized Cairo International Festival of Experimental Theater, CIFET, in 2002. He won all the prizes at the festival, best show, best director, best actor, for his Hamlet. And theater students saw it. And one of them was Hani Afifi, who 7 years later comes up with a show called I Am Hamlet, on the Hamlet. You can see it online on globalshakespeares.org. It's really fun. We couldn't include it in the anthology because it doesn't translate well to text. It's performative. There's a wonderful hip-hop piece in the middle of it. It would have looked pretty stupid on paper, we decided. I'm still not sure about that decision, but I still would have liked to see it in English. But it's a funny play, a contemporary Egyptian guy with no money is trying to have a life and have a girlfriend and trying to answer some unanswered questions about his life. It's sort of one of these things made on the cusp of the Arab uprisings that, in retrospect, can be said to have predicted the reasons for them. What I think that Hafifi learned from Al-Bassam and borrowed is the Fortinbras sequence. When Fortinbras comes in, this play was made in 2009. So in the United States, Obama was already president. But when Fortinbras comes in, he enters wearing a modern suit resembling a European president or Bush the son, Bush al-Ibn. And he says a lot of catchwords. He says, all this blood, all this violence, this terrorism. We have some interests in this region. We cannot allow one soldier of our armed forces to leave this land until we have secured our interests and laid the foundation for democracy and freedom in this country. This is more a conceit at this point than a real critique of Bush, because Bush isn't in power anymore to be critiqued. So Horatio says, Fortinbras, he says, the son, Fortinbras, the son, to, of course, giant laughs from the Cairo audience. And then when he starts to give a speech, the speech includes a lot of catchphrases like national security, fighting our enemies abroad rather than waiting for them to come to us, weapons of mass destruction, the war on terror, victory in the war on terror means victory in the war of ideas, human rights, persecution of minorities, we're safer, but we're not yet safe. You can see what he's doing. And arguably that particular kind of political localization of Fortinbras is something that he learned. Nahad Salah, sort of one of the leading Egyptian theater critics, thinks so, and I believe her, that he learned this from watching Al-Bassam's show when he was very young. That's a localization. Here's a weird globalization. One day, about 18 months ago, I got an email from Bashar Atpir, the screenwriter for Vishal Bhardwaj. And he told me that basically he had been hired to do a Kashmiri-themed adaptation of Hamlet. Or not, yeah, for Bhardwaj, to complete Bhardwaj's Shakespeare trilogy. If you haven't seen the other films, they're fantastic. Omkara and Makbul. Sort of Shakespeare goes Bollywood. But for Haider, for the last concluding gesture of this trilogy, he was looking for something even more spectacular. And so he hired Bashar Atpir, a Kashmiri journalist, to do this adaptation to the Kashmiri conflict. And Bashar Atpir was looking around, found my book, found references to productions including Al-Bassam's, found the globalshakespeares.org website and watched Al-Bassam's plays. And said basically, I read your book while I was writing the screenplay and it gave me the confidence to continue with a very political adaptation, Loved the Hamlet Summit. I watched a video of the performance online. So it's impossible to predict the paths by which these things happen. All the lines you think you can draw between Arab and Asian, South Asian, between Anglo-American and Soviet and French and Bollywood, all of these lines, and between academia and practice, incidentally, all these lines turn out to be completely unsustainable. And you learn that artists are basically voracious. They're omnivorous. They get what they can where they can, and if it resonates, they use it. Bhardwaj's adaptation is a melodrama. It runs for 2 hours and 40 minutes with an intermission in the middle. There are some songs. And although Gertrude finally detonates her suicide belt at the end, both the Hamlet and Claudius figures survive. Thus, in a way, we've come full circle to the sort of crowd-pleasing Hamlet adaptation with which we started, Dumas and Tanias Abdu's Hamlet. The Bhardwaj film aroused controversy it's the sort of thing that got covered on the political rather than the arts pages, for the way that it critiqued the effects of the Kashmir conflict on society, which is probably exactly what Bhardwaj was looking for. So perhaps the deepest lesson from Arab Shakespeare addresses the loaded question that everyone is asking this month at the 400th anniversary of Shakespeare's death. Namely, why do Shakespeare's plays continue to live and thrive in so many languages and so many media 4 full centuries after their creator departed this life? We now see that we can find quite interesting answers to this question by focusing not on any property of the plays themselves, although they are terrific, their emotional structure, their poetry, or whatever, but rather by focusing on the adapters whose new versions and subversions and perversions continue to give these plays new life. What expedients has Shakespeare served for those adapters? What itches has he scratched? What hungers has he fed? What has he allowed them to say that they could not say using other tools? What human and intellectual collaborations or wrestling matches have his plays enabled? Not necessarily between Britain and its former colonies, but between artists of talent all over the world, between Koizintsev, Kurosawa, and Olivier, between Al-Bassam in London and Kuwait, Hani Afifi in Cairo, and Bashar Pierre and Vishal Bhardwaj in Delhi. The NYU Abu Dhabi Global Shakespeare Student Festival of these past few days has been one example of such sort of unpredictable connections. And I think all the student groups taking part, none of whom are from Britain, will come away with a sense of expanded ownership and empowerment, not only over Shakespeare, but of their own aims and tools as artists. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for your really interesting talk. I wonder if there is any awareness among the writers that you're dealing with that Shakespeare himself was an adapter, that Shakespeare stories came from earlier sources, but I don't know if there was that level of dramaturgy involved.
Yes, there was. They did. My favorite example is Rafat Doueri's play Shakespeare the King, Shakespeare Rex, which was staged also as Shakespeare في عتبة, where it's like a Shakespeare in Love sort of frame where he goes back to the young Shakespeare who's written a few comedies. He's written The Merry Wives of Windsor, and he's like, oh my God, what should I do? Should I keep cranking out these comedies, or should I steal some play ideas from somebody else? Should I eat, or should I breathe free as an artist? So yeah, that's very much on the table. And the way that both Shakespeare and his characters produce theater by finding and catching and putting together what they can is very much thematized.
So my question is there a sense that there are varying shades of audience for these for the kind of intertextual path, if you like, so that there must be people who see the plays that have sprung out of Shakespeare who don't know the Shakespeare at all, and therefore their sense of what the story is not related to the manner of having Fortinbras, for instance, to complain about Hamlet's capitalism, lack of appeal to capitalists, rather. So I'm wondering about for someone like me, for instance, who was raised in the traditional Shakespeare thing, then what I'm excited by is the radical reinterpretation. Yeah. But that's because I know what the original is. But it seems to me that's that side of it is that there are varying responses to the people who, as it were, have whatever the relationship to the ur-text is.
I think in the early adaptations, people had no clue who Shakespeare was. And at that point, those were not being adapted for Marvin Carlson's idea of binocular vision. They weren't being adapted for the audience who watches two plays at once, the one that they know and the one that they're seeing in front of them. They were being adapted as script fodder because people needed stories and seats in theaters needed to be filled because the Khedive had built all these theaters. But later, the 1970s, 80s, 90s ones that I'm talking about, by then Hamlet had been completely naturalized. Everyone knew who he was. He had his Egyptian passport. And the theater public after 1970 also, the state theater sector shrank and the theater public got correspondingly smaller and a little bit better educated. And so probably everyone in the room would know the story even if they had never read the play. At least they would have a complex about not having read the play. Like when I taught Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead on the first day of my Global Shakespeare seminar, there were like one or two people in the classroom who hadn't read Hamlet, but they sort of knew where it lived. And they ran home and read it.
So I have to ask, can you say a little bit more about the translation about Hamlet's Hamlet into Arabic for a Japanese presentation?
Yeah. Yeah, it was a thing that fell oddly into its context. He's representing Arab theater, so he should do it in Arabic, right? Even if he happens to be Anglo-Kuwaiti and write in English, it would be more authentic if it were in Arabic. So he was actually offered funds by the Tokyo Festival to expand and revise it in a new Arabic version, which, of course, theater isn't about writing, meant hiring and training, rehearsing an Arab cast, which was the thing that became exciting for him. His own Arabic improved tremendously in this process, although he didn't do the translation himself, but he had to learn to direct in Arabic, which for him, basically, Suleiman is an interesting cat. After September 11th, he woke up to the fact that he was not just an aspiring London director with a funny last name, but that he was Kuwaiti. And he actually moved himself and his family back to Kuwait and learned to direct in Arabic, although he still doesn't write in Arabic. And the play was expanded. It got this kind of this horse of war skit that I was telling Dina about in the middle, the play within a play. It reads better in English. The Arabic is not great. It doesn't have the sort of muscle and bite of his English writing. What else can I tell you? Sort of how it toured. He and I had a long argument one time about why you would produce theater in Arabic for audiences that do not know Arabic. Because what you're doing is consigning your whole audience to spend the whole show bobbing their heads up and down like they're watching a ping pong game between the surtitles and the stage. And there are certain advantages that confers. One was that the character, we talked today in your class about how Shakespeare adaptations include interpolated characters. So he interpolated one character called the arms dealer. And the arms dealer is a sort of insider-outsider who gets by everyone, who ends up selling arms to everybody. To Polonius for his secret police efforts, and to Claudius for controlling the militias in the south, and to Laertes for fighting with those militias, and to Hamlet for his various militant activities. And he sells Ophelia her suicide bomb. At some point he sells Gertrude weapons too. I say he because in the second version, in the Arabic version, it's a man. In the original, it was a woman, and she was of indeterminate kind of ethnicity and nationality, and she slipped through everywhere. But Arabizing the play enabled him to introduce an English-speaking character. The brilliant English actor Nigel Barrett kind of came in and played him as a guy in a white linen suit. The sort of epitome of neo-colonial chic. And then the English-speaking audience, we'll bracket for a second how well the audience at the Tokyo Festival knows English. That's a different question. But the audience around the world where this toured to, who knows English better than Arabic, is put in the funny subject position of understanding only the bad guy. Right? When he speaks, you don't need surtitles. And so you're in this really awkward spot. And he did it again in his Richard III, where you identify only with this sort of really unpleasant character, the British, or no, the American ambassador in Iraq, or in whatever, unnamed country. And you make your audience, you put them into that situation of identifying with the one character who they would really like to dislike. And it's embarrassing, and it has an effect on the other actors because, like Hamlet, when he speaks to the arms dealer, instead of speaking fluent, beautiful Arabic, is forced to speak accented, broken English. And so you see how that interlingual mixing is made possible by this otherwise stupid device of directing in your supposedly native language to people who don't understand it.
So I see Macbeth is up there, and you mentioned Richard III. I'm wondering about the nasty characters in Shakespeare. So what I heard you talk was largely Hamlet. So I'm wondering about Macbeth and Richard III, because the idea of coup d'etat, of killing kings, of the whole politics of those plays would seem, apposite, appropriate.
Yeah, absolutely.
And are they done often or ever since 1900 or what? Especially Richard III and Macbeth.
Yeah, so Macbeth for a long time was off the table.
Because?
Everyone knew what it was about. It was too transparent. The censors wouldn't pass it, and the theaters wouldn't dare to stage it. Even though there's plausible deniability and you're just talking about some guy in Scotland, it was too close. And so instead, Hamlet was done as Macbeth, with Claudius as Macbeth. That became the play about usurpation and tyranny. It was just too naked. There was a version, there's a French Tunisian co-production that was commissioned for the 2012 festival, the World Shakespeare Festival that took place around the 2012 Olympics. There were like two global Shakespeare festivals going on at the same time, one in London and one in Stratford. And this one was commissioned for the London one, where Leila and Ben, Zainuddin Ibn Ali, was cast as Macbeth, and audience members were called out. I didn't see this one. I talked to people who saw it. I read about it. But audience members were sort of called out to reflect on the things that Macbeth leaves out, the play, Shakespeare's play Macbeth. It doesn't include a character of the people and what's their role. And that conversation is explicitly being had on stage. This is a marginal phenomenon, right? It's a European commission. It's 2012 reflecting on the unfinished business of 2011. In the 20th century, I don't know of high-profile productions. Richard III, Jawad al-Asadi, who did Forget Hamlet, claimed for a while to be working on a Richard III. He dropped it. Suleiman al-Bassam did a very, very successful Richard III, an Arab tragedy that was in, so he redid the history as a tragedy, in 2007. And that was about, it wasn't about Saddam, but it was about the American invasion of Iraq.
What about a hero play like Henry V?
I have not heard of good uses of the history plays other than Richard III. And there was a Palestinian Richard II, but that happened sort of again as a result of a London commission.
I'm more familiar with the Arab Oedipus.
Yes.
And I know the four plays that what's his name? Your colleague actually translated.
Marvin Carlson.
Yeah, that's right. Of course, there's one by Ali Salim, who's
You're the one who killed the Wahsh, yeah.
Yeah. Ali Salim is extremely funny satirist. I mean, he's a comedian, but extremely funny. So I was wondering, has Ali Salim done any other? Has he done any Shakespeare?
Not that I know of.
No. Because So there is an absence. None of the comedies or the romances are adapted into Arabic. It seems.
There are movie versions. I don't do film. I don't know about this, but one of my colleagues has written about a movie version of Taming of the Shrew. And there may be more than one.